So welcome everyone to today's webinar on how to be a wildly effective compliance officer. I'm Glenda Bean, Director of the Currin Insurance Compliance Education Program, otherwise known as KICT. Webinars are one part of the KICT program, and we're very excited about today's interview with Kristy Grant-Hart. I do want to let you guys know about a special course we're building right now. You're actually the first group of people we're discussing it with, so it's very exciting. It's called Compliance Hero 101, Everything You Need to Become an Ultra-Effective Compliance Professional. It's perfect for those who are in compliance, who really are looking for a clear path on how to be more effective in their role. You can actually click the link in your sidebar to go learn more about the course. We're still finalizing the content, but it's open for enrollment right now. After we launch this initial run, we may close it off at some point and possibly relaunch at a later date, but it's open right now, so go check it out and sign up if you're interested. And while you're there, you can also check out our entire online on-demand educational platform. So definitely go check it out. If you have questions about it, you can just email me at gbean@currincompliance.com. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Kaylee so she can kick us off for today's interview. Kaylee?
Thanks, Glenda. Welcome, everyone. This is Kaylee Currin, President of Currin Compliance Services. I'm thrilled to have as our guest today, as Glenda mentioned, Kristy Grant-Hart, founder of Spark Compliance Consulting and author of the recently published book, How to Be a Wildly Effective Compliance Officer, where we learn the secrets of influence, motivation, and persuasion to become an in-demand business asset. Welcome, Kristy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kristy, I first read about your book in the Wall Street Journal last month. You and the book were featured in the paper's Risk and Compliance Journal. Congratulations on that. What a great way to launch this book.
Thank you so much. It was really quite thrilling, actually.
I'm sure it was. Sitting there in my living room over my morning coffee, I ordered a copy from Amazon right away. And after I read it, I ordered more copies for the office. I think there's a lot of really great information and insight there, and it's easy to read and apply right away for any compliance professional. What made you decide to write a book about compliance, and specifically a book that's so accessible?
I think that when I wrote the book, I was the Chief Compliance Officer at United International Pictures, and I was watching so many of my colleagues really struggle with connecting in an emotional way with the business. And maybe not having the sort of techniques to get the emotional buy-in that they needed to be successful. So I did a couple of talks about that in London, where I'm based, and around, and realized there was a real need for this information. So I decided to write a book, and that's what happened.
One of the first things you talk about in the book is that there are 4 primary motivators that can be appealed to by compliance officers when dealing with the larger corporate audience of stakeholders. That was really interesting to me because I often see a heavy reliance on just 2 of them, fear for self and fear for business, but little use of the other 2. Can you explain these primary motivators and why we should think about all 4?
Absolutely. I think that when you're doing compliance training, or when I was doing compliance training, one of the things I noticed was that people really respond to different types of motivation and tend to be one of 4 categories. And those were the basis for the 4 primary motivators. The first one is fear for self. So that's the fear base, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to have bad things happen to me. I don't want to be fired. And that can be highly motivating for many people. As can the second related motivator, which is fear for the business. That tends to be people who are really proud of the business's reputation. They're afraid of the stock price going down. They're afraid of the reputation of the business being drugged through the mud. And so people with those fear bases respond really well to stories of other people, going to jail, or customers or related businesses having compliance failures that create catastrophe. But if you only deal with fear, you're missing part of your audience. So the other motivators are really quite different. One of them is the idea of noble cause. So people in compliance tend to be noble cause folks. They are people who really believe in ethics and compliance, and they want their company to be the best, the most ethical, the most compliant, and they really respond to values and ethics-driven training and things that are about being the most effective and best corporate citizen that the company can be. And the fourth primary motivator is the idea of competitive edge, and this one I find works particularly well with salespeople. So this is the idea that you can use compliance in order to be a market-driving force. I'll give you an example. When I was the director of compliance at Carlson Wisely Travel, in our Asia group, we found that when one of the scandals hit, in GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, the travel agencies were being used to funnel bribes to some of the surgeons. And our company didn't have any of those affiliations, and suddenly the whole pharma industry in Asia was coming to try to work with us because we didn't have this problem. So the salespeople throughout the company could see that actually using compliance could be a competitive edge. And what I have developed is this idea that you should use all four motivators whenever you are doing large group training or online training, or particularly in-person training, so that you're really touching each individual. So you're telling stories that relate to a fear for self, and you're telling a story that relates to a fear for the business, but also evoking that idea of being very noble and being a great compliant company, as well as how you can use competitive edge or use that motivation. So when you put them all together, you really can be more effective in training because you can touch each person emotionally and get their buy-in that way.
Throughout the book, you talk a lot about interacting with others in the organization, and you help the reader strategize about ways to think about the firm and stakeholders in order to be more effective. One of the other ways you talk about is in relation to the wildly effective compliance officer risk matrix. And I've been thinking about this tool lately because the chief compliance officer of a client company of ours told me recently that he's changing jobs and he's going to be CCO counsel at another small life insurance company. Can you talk a bit about how the risk matrix might help him as he moves into a new job?
Yeah, absolutely. So this matrix, this idea, came from a book that I read when I was taking over my new role that talked about the difference between a company's readiness for change and need for change, and how when you approach the company, you need to really think about where it is on these two scales or these two different axes. And when you apply it to compliance, there's a quiz in the book that helps you figure out where you might be on this scale. But the idea is if your company has a high readiness for change and a high need for change, so let's say that you're under investigation, or that your sister company is been hammered with a fine, you're going to come into that role, or he's going to come into that role with a strong need for change and readiness for change, and this probably is coming quite aggressively and say, this is what we're doing, this is how we're changing it, I have a plan, follow me. Versus if you're at a place, or he's going to a place with a more mature program where the basics are all in place and you're really tweaking things or just responding to the new laws that are coming out, where you're going to want to have a much more subtle approach, saying, thank you so much for the good work that's already been done here. Let me tell you how we're going to make it even better. And so this idea is that you can go to the company with the best approach based on how ready they are for change and how needy they are for change.
Yeah, it seems like that might be really helpful as a way to avoid assuming that just because you're going from one small insurance company to another small company, that the issues are the same and the approach should be the same. Is the tool
every place is different.
Right.
Go ahead.
Is the tool also useful for someone who's been in the same job for a while? How could it be used in that situation?
I think definitely it's always good to check your approach based on what's going on in your company. But whenever you have a significant shift, so let's say that you learned about a significant compliance failure, whether or not it's going to be reported to an agency, or you have a new law that's really going to shift or change things for you, or even new hires, people coming in or leaving your team. Anytime you have something that's substantial, you want to look at your approach and see if it needs to be shifted. And I think the risk matrix can be very helpful in defining a useful approach for the situation in which you find yourself.
And as I said, this colleague of mine is also taking on a counsel role. And I've often said in talking to people that I think that's a really hard combination, but it's also a really common one in small companies. You and I are both attorneys, but we both moved into compliance generally and specifically compliance consulting. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of a dual role and how you ended up choosing compliance?
Absolutely. I think that trying to do both can be very tricky if you are acting as legal counsel and as compliance counsel. But I think that the major difference is this idea in compliance of values-based or ethics-based decision-making. I find that to be the biggest change, and also the idea that you want to document everything and have things in writing, because in my experience, when you're talking to a general counsel or someone else who may act specifically as a lawyer all the time, they don't want things in writing. And you know, as a compliance practitioner, your defensibility is basically, you know, everything has to be in writing and written down, and to show that you're doing your job. But I think that, you know, the biggest thing for me was I liked the training. I liked working with the business on a more strategic level. I think that a lot of lawyers don't get to do the kind of business decision making and strategy that I got to do as a compliance officer and as a compliance consultant, helping companies build their compliance functions. That I find that the most fun.
I agree. I think that's a great part of the job as a compliance consultant. When you were talking about the differences between the two roles, one of the other things in your book is a compliance officer decision tree that I think is a great way to help see some of those differences and to find the places where there are those ethics and values consideration. And I think that could be really helpful for someone who's trying to serve in both functions to help keep those roles separate. So this is the compliance officer decision tree that we have up on the screen now. Can you walk us through it and perhaps give us an example of how it might be applied on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. This came to me when I was having essentially what turned out to be an argument with the CEO at the company that I was at. We were looking at whether or not we could accept cash in our Greek offices. It was during the time when the euro was having, Greece was looking like it was going to default. And we had a policy that said we don't accept cash in our offices. And she called me and she said, "Is it legal for us to accept cash?" And I said, "Yeah, it's legal." And it turned out by the end of the conversation, I realized she didn't want to know if it was legal. She wanted to know if it was a bad idea. So I spent the weekend thinking about this and coming up with a way to describe to her what it is I do, because I was the first compliance officer there, and how to use me. And I came up with this decision tree. And as a compliance officer, you don't stop at, is it legal? You start with, is it legal? If the answer is no, you don't do it, right? You don't do whatever it is. But the considerations are deeper than that. So if it is legal, the next question then becomes, is it ethical? And if the answer to that is no, then we don't do it. But it becomes more interesting after that, because the next question is it against our policies? And if the answer to that question is yes, for instance, in my situation with Greece, it was against our policy, but is our policy the major determiner? And if the answer is, well, there's a reason for an exception, then you document the exception, or you change the policy, whichever makes more sense. But if it gets through the is it against our policy question, then it gets to the last part, which is it a bad idea? And to me, my job isn't to make the decision about whether it's a bad idea. My job is to comment on the risk, to talk about what the risks are, and to, you know, let the business have the risk appetite to say, yes, we want to do it anyway, and I will put in the policy or procedure that I can to mitigate risk where possible. Or to say, you know what, it's too bad an idea, there's too much risk, we're not doing it. But I think that there is a tendency in some business people to either, you know, misuse compliance to say, well, compliance told me I could do it. And the answer is, well, I told you could do it, not that you should, that's up to you. Or to try to, you know, play the blame game where it's not really our place to make the final decision if it is legal, ethical, and, you know, in accordance with our policies. So I think the tree can be really helpful when you're not sure how to respond.
And so then is this something that you share with stakeholders so that they can also see that process?
I did with those who didn't seem to understand what to do with me. A lot of times it's too granular or not interesting for them. But I think that if you have someone where you have that miscommunication, where the question was, she was asking, is it legal? But the frustration was what she wanted to know was, what are the risks? And I think that if you can get to the place where you're having the conversation the way you should be, if any tool to get there is useful, particularly in places where they haven't had a compliance program. That's been my challenge in the jobs that I've had, is starting it from scratch and teaching people essentially, what is compliance? What areas should they come to me for? What do I do? How do I work with legal and HR and audit? So that we, have a program that makes sense. And that's just an education, I think, that people need to get to.
Yeah, and this seemed like something that you could really keep on your desk as sort of a framework to work through issues on a day-to-day basis. But for longer term planning and reporting, you also have a compliance dashboard. And again, thinking back to my friend who's taking on this new job, your compliance dashboard seems like it might be helpful since he's going to a small company and there may not be a strong compliance infrastructure in place. So there may be some flexibility in terms of how to present his work to others. How did you come up with this, and how might it be used in practice?
I came up with it actually with the help of my friend Joe Morgan at Rolls-Royce. I had just become a chief compliance officer, first time in the role, about a month in, and we were out for cocktails, and I said, I'm not sure how to show them what I'm doing or what I'm doing every month or how I'm progressing. And she said, well, you need a dashboard. And it was interesting because, being London based and not having the US as one of my territories, I still wanted to use the framework from the federal sentencing guidelines in the United States, because I think that the way they lay out the elements of a program is so smart. So what I did was I called it the Big Seven and separated the different elements or areas of a compliance program, and then went to my board with a 3-year sort of vision for where I wanted to be, and then an annual, like the first year goals. And so within each area, it helped me to have specific targets that I could say I was working toward. And what I did with this was every month I would simply update the bullet points for whatever I had been able to accomplish, whether I was, had been in 2 territories doing training, or we had, rolled out a new policy and sent an update on the whistleblower hotline, or whatever it was. And for me, it was really helpful because it gave the business and gave the board a really solid understanding that I was progressing every month. Because one of the challenges, I think, for many compliance officers is this sort of backward-facing compliance, where you're always putting out fires and not creating, a solid singular vision that the board has bought into. And once you've got that strategy, and the compliance dashboard will help you to prioritize to meet your annual goals and to show that you're getting the work done.
And I think another related struggle is how to demonstrate in our increasingly data-driven world how compliance is being effective. Because often when compliance is working, things are quiet. And that can lead some people to think that maybe it's less necessary. What strategies or ideas do you have on how to demonstrate the value of a strong compliance program when things are going really well?
Yeah. It's always a challenge. I think that compliance basically goes in cycles, where people say, oh my gosh, we have a horrible problem, put resources into it. And then they say, well, it's quiet and you're doing a good job, so we can take resources away. And then you need them again. And it really does appear to be very cyclical. But I think that the best way to avoid having resources taken is really to have that buy-in for your longer term vision. So if everyone agrees that, within 3 years' time, we want a certain amount of training, we want a certain amount of policies and procedures, or travel to, various areas or territories, I think that really helps when we all agree on what a good program looks like, so that you can deliver that with everybody's agreement as that's where you're going. obviously, most boards love metrics. They like to know percentage of people trained, and how many whistleblower calls you get, which, personally, I don't think that's a terrific one, but everyone seems to want to know, how long it took to resolve the issues, et cetera. But I think that there's a real danger in overly relying on metrics. I think that the best thing that you can do is really, try to measure culture. And if you have the capacity to have, a program evaluation. I remember at one of my jobs where we did a program evaluation and they gave letter grades, A to F, for how people understood antitrust and bribery and our trade sanctions policy or whatever. And the CEO was competitive about it. Something got a C, and we need to fix that. And resources were given to fix that problem. So sometimes having an outside person say what's good and bad can be helpful. But more than anything, it's just, keeping the shared vision and reporting on how you are improving the culture and the place.
And Kristy, your book focuses a lot and uses the term compliance officers, and some of those examples that you've used really talk about the people who are leading the compliance effort at a company. So perhaps the book is directed primarily at chief compliance officers, but does it also apply to those of us who are in compliance departments but are not the CCO?
Absolutely. I think that anytime you're dealing with a stakeholder, whether it is your boss or the country manager or the manager of the stores that you operate, whatever it is, you need to have persuasion, influence, and capacity to understand motivation. So the more that everybody has to do stakeholder management, and so much of the book is really about strategy with respect to whoever your stakeholder is, and about strategies for influence that are with whomever it is you have to influence. So I think that while some of the examples do talk about the board or the C-suite, that it's really interchangeable with whoever is the important person you need to influence.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, but we still have a few minutes left. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared so far. But in closing, do you have a top 5 or so things that you'd like to tell those of us who want to be wildly effective in our compliance jobs?
Yeah, I do. I think that the first thing is really to humanize yourself and make friends with the business. I actually went out to breakfast this morning with a new compliance officer who said that she's trying to be perfect all of the time, and she's afraid of essentially showing weakness or vulnerability or her humanity. And I think that can be a mistake, because people really want to know who you are, and they're so much more likely to come to you when they have problems if they trust you as a person. So if you can, talk about your kids or your dog or your hobbies or sports or weather, all of those things, really to become somebody who they're friends with, who the business is friends with, it makes a big difference. A lot of times, particularly, women being very responsible tend to, leave meetings and go back and do email, as opposed to, staying out or going to the bar with everybody, or going to the dinner. And that can be damaging from your capacity to be influential and really have a human relationship. So that would be the first thing, is to get there. The second thing really is to create that shared strategy. The more you can work with whoever your stakeholder is to define what is good and how will I know when we got there. If you don't design that with them, they will have it in their mind that they created, and you're suddenly trying to swim uphill, not knowing what the finish line looks like. So from a strategy perspective, the more you can get a shared vision, the better. And the second great thing about a shared vision is when you say, okay, this is what good is. We agree on that. These are the resources I need to get to our shared vision of good. That really also makes a huge difference in getting a yes to the resource request, because you have an idea of where you're going and can explain why you need them. And I think for me, the very most important thing is to always come back to your sense of purpose and mission and why you're doing this. For me, I truly believe that compliance is changing the world. I think that, corporate compliance as a global idea is shifting the way that business is done. And while it may seem like, we're just doing anti-money laundering, policies or tick box compliance or, clicking through your online training. Actually, as a movement through the global world, it's an incredible thing to be a part of it. And sometimes when I, get depressed or it gets hard, to remember that you're part of this fantastic community of people doing great work can be really fundamentally inspiring.
Well, thank you so much, Kristy, for taking the time to talk to us about your book and your experiences as a compliance officer. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just, stay in touch. I'm one of those compliance people that loves to talk about it, like to write about it and think about it. So, I'm active on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of that stuff. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you and to be before your friends and colleagues and work people. I sincerely appreciate it.
Well, you can see on the screen Kristy's contact information, and it has been a pleasure. Thanks to all of you for taking the time out of your busy day to participate. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Glenda.
All right. Hi. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristy and Kaylee. I hope everyone tuning in enjoyed that as much as I did. If you guys are looking for even more ways to become effective in your compliance role, click that link in the sidebar to check out our upcoming course, Compliance Hero 101. If you have any questions at all, just email me at gbean@currincompliance.com. I want to thank Kristy again for taking the time to share her insights with us, and thank you to everyone who took the time to tune in with us today. I hope you all have a really great day. Thanks.